Hello, can everybody hear me? Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to this climate change webinar series of the E-Institute. Today, we will focus on a carbon tax and how a tax shift can support low emissions development while building public acceptance. We will specifically focus on British Columbia, Canada. That was the first jurisdiction in North America to implement a carbon tax. I'm very proud to present our speaker today, which is Stuart Elgee. Stuart Elgee is a professor of law and economics at the University of Ottawa and director of the university's Interdisciplinary Environment Institute. He is also the founder and chair of Sustainable Prosperity, which is Canada's major green economy think tank and policy research network. I don't want to take more of yours or Stuart's precious time. We start. Sit back, listen, and I hope that you all will gather a big collection of interesting and intriguing questions for our Q&A session that will follow Stuart's presentation. Thank you, everyone, and welcome.
Okay, I guess that's over to me then. I was going to ask if everyone could hear me okay, but of course you guys can't answer that. So this is my first global webinar. I'm excited and a little bit terrified about it. Thank you for the kind introduction. As was said, I'm here with two hats. One is I'm a professor of law and economics at the University of Ottawa, but also chair of the main environment economy research network and think tank in Canada, which is known as Sustainable Prosperity. And let's see if I can get this clicker to work. Which has been set up and working here for about 5 or 6 years. It's been an interesting experience, and if anyone's interested in learning about starting these kind of things in different countries, I'd be happy to talk with you about it offline. Basically, we do three things. We try to actually generate research on environment economy and particularly market-based approaches. Second thing is we try and actually connect that research in with decision makers so it doesn't just stay within academia and think tanks, and ultimately try and lead to actual policy reform if we can by linking that into policy processes, particularly in Canada, but also increasingly in other countries as well. Now, on to BC's experience. As you know, North America isn't really thought of as a friendly place for climate change policy, and particularly Canada in recent years. But one thing most people don't know is that one of the provinces in Canada, British Columbia, actually has one of the world's most ambitious carbon tax shift policies. British Columbia is the most westerly province in Canada, for those of you not familiar with the country. And essentially, you see here the details, right? It started in July 1st, 2008. What's interesting is they only announced it as an idea in November of 2007, announced it as a decision in the budget of February 2008, and it took effect by July 1st. So it all happened quite quickly. The tax started pretty low. It started at just $10 a ton, and it went up $5 a year over the next 4 years to hit $30 a ton last July 1st. That's about 23 euros for those of you without Canadian currency in your pocket. So a staged implementation. Its coverage is fairly comprehensive. It covers all fuel use and most greenhouse gas emissions. There's some kinds of process emissions it doesn't capture. We can talk about that if anyone's interested. Other interesting thing is all of the revenues are shifted back into income tax cut, 100%, both corporate and personal income tax. In addition, there are some targeted reductions for vulnerable populations and rural regions. So one interesting thing, which we can talk about later, is that British Columbia thought when they did this that the rest of North America would follow it, and it hasn't. British Columbia is well out ahead of most of the rest of the continent in terms of carbon pricing, and that also makes this a pretty interesting experiment. Okay, so how's it worked? I'm going to focus particularly on the environmental results. That's where we have the most data, but I'll talk a little bit about the economic and political implications as well. This is a paper that's about to get published in a major academic journal in the next couple of months. So basically, my methods, we focused particularly on the impact on the use of fossil fuels, and we did that because the data on fossil fuels is about 1 or 2 years more current than greenhouse gas data. As you guys probably know, greenhouse gas reporting lags by 1 to 2 years, so we can get a more up-to-date picture looking at fuels. comes mainly from the Statistics Canada data, Canada's main data collection agency, which we've just reworked. So it's the best data we can get. And what we've particularly tried to do is to try to isolate what effects the tax itself had, as opposed to just general changes throughout the economy. And you'll see as I go through it a few different ways in which we've tried to separate the effects of the tax itself. Okay, so let me see if I can figure out this a little quicker here. There we go. Here's the main slide, and this is really the most, if you don't remember anything else, remember this slide. So over the 4 years it's been in effect, this shows the changes in British Columbia's fuel use compared to the rest of Canada. And what you see here is that BC's fuel use has gone down over 17%, while use in the rest of Canada has gone up slightly. So the net difference is about a 19% gain or 19% reduction in fuel use in BC compared to the rest of Canada. Using the rest of Canada as a comparator is interesting because it's gone through basically the same economic cycles BC has. So you can't say, well, it's because BC's economy's gone up or down, because the rest of the country's gone through essentially the same economic cycles. Something different is happening in British Columbia, and that something started in 2008. Let's go on to the next example. So just for those of you who are interested in how the fuel use correlates to greenhouse gases, this is my one slide on greenhouse gases. Luckily, the new numbers just came out a couple of weeks ago, so the data only lags by 1 year at this point. And what you see is BC's GHG emissions down by 10% in the first 3 years since the tax came in, compared to 1% in Canada. So BC's GHGs have dropped by 9% compared to the rest of Canada. And there's some reasons why that gap is a little bit different than we saw in fuel use. The main difference is it's a different time period. It doesn't go as far into 2012. It also picks up the first 6 months of 2008 before the carbon tax came in, simply because of the way the data is reported annually. But the same general trend line. GHG emissions down significantly since the carbon tax came in. That's the main thing to take home from this. Some people say, well, that's simply because people in Vancouver are crossing the border to buy their gas in Seattle. It's about 2 hours away. So one of the things we've done is tested the impacts on all of the different types of fuels covered by the carbon tax. And you see the main ones here. I've ignored some of the really tiny ones that are very small volume. But propane, motor gas, diesel, home heating oil, petroleum coke. And what you see in each case is that emissions have dropped by a minimum of 10% in BC compared to the rest of Canada. For some types of fuels, much more. In other words, we've seen the change across all types of fuel use, which means different types of users, different regions, industry, private sector. I'm reading the comments here. It looks like you guys mostly have decent volume. That's good. So what that tells us is it isn't just about driving behavior. And what's really interesting is this. If you look at the last type, aviation fuel, that's largely exempt from the carbon tax. And there we've seen almost no change between BC and the rest of Canada. So the one area where the carbon tax doesn't apply, we've seen no change. In the 5 fuels where it does apply, we've seen significant change. Now again, that reinforces the message that it probably is the carbon tax that's having some kind of an effect. And lastly, let's look before and after. It's a classic academic approach, a time series. So if you look at the 8 years before the carbon tax came in, you see the line on the screen there, the vertical line, that's the date the carbon tax came in. In the 8 years prior to that, BC's fuel use stayed roughly consistent with the rest of Canada. They both went up and down, but over the 8-year period, there was really no net change between Canada and BC. Since the carbon tax came in, dramatic change. BC's pulled ahead of Canada by 5% per year in terms of fuel efficiency since July 1st, 2008. So again, this all suggests that something happened the day the carbon tax came in that induced a big change. Is this unusual? Well, no. If you look at the various jurisdictions around the world that have brought in different types of carbon taxes, you see the similar type of change. So this is a slide done by Thomas Sterner, an economist in Sweden, about 9 years ago. And it looks at the correlation between fuel taxes and fuel use. And what you see is a very close correlation. those jurisdictions that have the highest fuel taxes by far have the lowest fuel use, and vice versa. The little pink circle in the bottom is Canada, the US, and Australia, which have among the lowest fuel taxes and the highest fuel use. So not surprisingly, when you charge more for something, people use less of it. That's you don't have to be a sophisticated economist to know that. What's particularly interesting here, though, is the magnitude of the impact we've seen in BC. This is a paper about to be published by two of my economist colleagues here at the university that's looked at, it's a sophisticated econometric analysis teasing out the impact this tax has had on driving fuel specifically. And what they've looked at is how this level of carbon tax compares to an equivalent level of change in just the price of gas. So if the price of gas had changed by the same amount as the carbon tax has changed each year in BC, what level of impact would that have had on fuel use? And what you see is 5 times greater impact from the tax than would have happened from a similar price change alone. That's really interesting, at least to academic types like us. Because you try to think about why is that the case? Why is it having so much bigger impact than price? They offer a few explanations. One is the idea that this carbon tax change was going to be lasting, not simply a transient bump up and down in the price of fuel. And partly that's because BC committed from the start to a 5-year phase-in. So people made assumptions that this is going to be around and get higher over the next 5 years. If I'm making investments in a new car, a new heater for my house, it makes sense to invest in fuel efficiency now because there's going to be a payback, unlike the price of gas, which may bounce around. Second reason is probably what's known in economics as the announcement effect, or probably here the awareness effect. And that is there's been a lot of media around BC's carbon tax. And each year, July 1st, as the tax goes up, there's a lot of media again. And so this tax has a high level of awareness in the population compared to just daily changes in the price of fuel, which almost is background noise. The last, though, is really interesting. It's sort of a reverse free rider effect. So the idea is that many of us would actually like to improve our fuel efficiency, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But we're not likely to do it unless we think that our neighbors are going to do it too. With the carbon tax coming in, we assume that our neighbors are going to have the same kind of incentives that we have, that the rest of the province is going to be working on fuel reductions. And so I'm more likely to do the things that I would like to do anyway, because this carbon tax is pushing all of us in that direction. And it kind of creates its own momentum. Anyway, all of these are their explanations, but they need further research to test them out. Okay, let's try this. We haven't done in-depth research yet to break out the impacts on the economy, but at a high level, here's how BC's GDP has compared to the rest of Canada since the tax came in. And what you see is almost no difference. BC is 0.1% ahead of Canada over that period. But the carbon tax is only a small part of the economy, so I don't think we can draw any conclusions other than this. There is no evidence that the carbon tax has had any adverse economic effects across the economy. And that's really interesting because when it came in, a lot of people had predicted that this would have significant economic effects. And we just haven't seen them. I'll talk in a minute about how this compares to the experience in the EU where it's been around longer. Now, of course, some individuals, there's winners and losers with any tax shift, right? You see anybody who's a particularly high fuel user probably is paying a little more tax. One sector in particular we're looking at is agriculture, and our initial results suggest that there's been a very, very small impact, less than 0.5% on agriculture. But at the same time, British Columbia's clean technology sector has more than doubled in that period, way ahead of the rest of the country. Now, again, not all of those because of the carbon tax, but you're seeing winners and losers. One thing which is important to keep in mind, though, British Columbia relies mainly on hydroelectric power. It is not a coal-powered jurisdiction. And so in BC, you're not looking at a tax that affects a major energy source. It's mainly on transportation fuels, home heating. That said, there are some industries, particularly in remote communities, that do use fossil fuels as an energy source, but it's not the same as places that use it significantly. So here's how BC's experience compares to European Union. There was a major study done a few years ago, which is the most comprehensive study of environmental tax shifting I'm aware of, done by a team of leading European economists. It looked at carbon tax shifts in 6 different European countries going back 10 to 15 years. What you see on the left is the impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Not surprisingly, they went down, anywhere from 2 to 6%, which is a pretty significant number, more or less the size of the Kyoto target, for example. But the interesting one is on the right. This is the impact on GDP, and this study did isolate the effects of the tax alone. And what you see is anything ranging from a neutral to a slightly positive impact on GDP. And to me, that's the main story, that they brought in a significant climate change policy and did it without adverse effects on the economy, maybe slight positive impacts. The study goes into more detail about why that happened, and particularly it was the tax shifting that made the difference. That all of the revenues from the carbon tax went into lowering income and labor taxes. If it hadn't done that, they found there would have been small negative impacts on GDP, but because they reduced another tax, a tax that is more distortionary, a tax that discourages investment, discourages employment, they actually found neutral to slightly positive impact. So BC's experience is tracking in that same direction, but obviously too early to draw real conclusions about the economic side. One thing we can say, though, is that BC taxpayers have actually come out slightly ahead. So the government tries to estimate the amount of carbon tax revenues each year and offset that with income tax cuts. But the way things have worked out, they've actually reduced taxes on income more than they've increased taxes on carbon. So BC taxpayers have come out ahead by about $500 million in taxes so far. And just for context, it's a province with a population of under 4 million people. So pretty significant net tax cuts. Also, because of the carbon tax, British Columbia, as of 2012, had the lowest corporate income tax and the lowest personal income tax in Canada, other than for really high income earners. So the carbon tax has allowed BC to become a very attractive jurisdiction from a tax perspective, both for individuals and corporations. Now the interesting stuff, the politics. Of course, everyone always says it's easy to talk about this as good policy, but the politics are hard. So in British Columbia, I'm not going to get into great detail, but I'll give you just the top level of the story. Why did this happen? Probably more than anything else, it's because British Columbia had a premier, Gordon Campbell, who really understood the significance of climate change and understood that they needed to get a handle on it and wanted to do it in the most economically effective way possible. In part, they were following California's lead. Governor Schwarzenegger, shortly before this, had announced the Western Climate Initiative and a series of very ambitious climate policies led by California, which have now been playing out over the subsequent 5 years. So British Columbia and California occupy somewhat similar both physical and political space in our two countries, and that leadership role helped. Timing helped. I'll show you in a minute that at the time they announced it, concern for global warming was relatively high, the economy was fairly healthy, and gas prices were more or less steady. So the kind of larger societal factors that influence the politics were in pretty good shape. And after the announcement, the result is that there was more than 50% support for this announcement, which for a tax is pretty good. Now, what's interesting in Canada is we have a comparison. 6 months later, we had a federal election where the leader of the Liberal Party, one of our two major parties, also proposed a major carbon tax shift and made it a central issue in the federal election. It was a more complex proposal. It involved redistributing carbon taxes for various environmental and social purposes. So it was a little harder to explain. It wasn't as clean as a straight tax shift in BC. And anyway, the net result was that they lost that election, lost it fairly badly. And a number of people blamed that in part on the tax shift proposal. We've seen later from the polling results that it wasn't actually particularly because of the proposal. There were other reasons. One of them was the leader who introduced it was not a particularly good communicator. He was a well-intentioned guy and a smart guy, but not a great political communicator. And the timing was also bad, as I'll show you in the subsequent slides. So again, this is an interesting lesson in the politics of this stuff. Here's a slide that looks at Google searches for 3 different terms. There's a lot going on here, but you can probably see the orange line is concern for global warming as reflected by Google searches in Canada. And you'll see when BC's carbon tax is announced, a a lot of searches for global warming. By the time of the federal election, concern for global warming is lower. At the same time, concern for the economy has risen. There's the beginning of warning signs of a recession. So those are kicking in within the 6 months before the federal election. And so the politics had begun to shift. Similarly, gas prices. If you look at the time BC's carbon tax came in, gas prices in Canada had started to rise a little bit, but they had more or less been level for several months and hadn't really spiked. Shortly after BC's carbon tax, there was a big spike in gas prices in Canada, and those coincided with the time of the federal election, when the result was so poor. Interestingly, they dropped quickly shortly after that, so sometimes in politics timing matters, but these were factors. Obviously, politics is about larger social issues, and these economic and environmental concerns in the public contributed to some of the political realities of these two different proposals. What's interesting is, though, there's I guess a more or less happy ending if you believe in carbon taxes as a good policy. Back to British Columbia, the next election happens the following year in British Columbia. The provincial election is in May 2009, and the opposition party, which is our left-wing party, the Labour New Democratic Party, decides they're going to make the carbon tax a big issue in that election. And they have this Axe the Tax campaign. The Liberal Party, the one that brought it in, didn't fought against making that an issue. They kept the focus on the overall economy. They kept the focus on their overall climate change policy. They didn't let the carbon tax itself become a major issue. They put it in the context of overall economic and climate policies. So they took a different strategy than we saw in the federal election, where the carbon tax shift itself was a big focus. And the other interesting thing we saw is many environmental groups that usually support this left-wing party shifted and switched their support for the center right-wing party that had brought in the carbon tax. So we saw a shifting of the traditional environmental voter base. The result was the Liberal Party, the one that brought in the carbon tax, was re-elected with a slightly increased majority. So we saw a second election where the carbon tax was a major issue, but in this case, the result was the party actually not only survived, but slightly increased its majority. And a number of commenters noted the fact that we had now seen the first example in Canada of a blue-green voting coalition. The idea that you could be a conservative voter but also vote for environmental issues, which is politically interesting. Anyway, what are some of the quick lessons on politics? Some of them are simple. Obviously, keeping the policy simple makes a lot of sense. Communicating well obviously makes sense. Some of the factors in BC's policy that I think helped it politically were that it was well designed. The tax started at a low level, the initial impact was low, and it rose over time. So people had time to anticipate it and adjust. It didn't hit them right away in a big way when they had no time to react. Second lesson is how you recycle the revenues matters. In the case of British Columbia, the fact that 100% went back into income tax cuts helped them, at least in their circumstances, that matters. Timing matters, we talked about that. Other interesting thing, though, is BC didn't make this a major election issue. They just did it. The time between the announcement of the tax was less than 6 months, so there was some public input, but it wasn't a major drawn-out election issue. And my experience is making something like this, a complex policy issue, a major election issue, isn't always a great idea. What's interesting now is support for the carbon tax in BC. There's different polls, but they generally find support around 60%, which is amazing for any kind of tax. British Columbia, as you can imagine, is not a jurisdiction where people particularly like taxes, but support for this one is over 60%. So the take-home message is a carbon tax does not have to hurt politically if it's done right. We can talk in the question period about an interesting pet theory I have, which is that it might actually be a little bit easier for a right-of-center party to bring this thing in because they're more guarded on their economic claim. But that's a subject for discussion. I'll throw that out. So in the remaining few minutes, let me just talk a little bit about broader environmental taxation for those who may be less familiar with it. You hear a lot of focus on carbon taxes, but in reality, many countries have these type of eco-taxes on a range of different types of pollutants or resource use. And you see some of these slides just giving examples. Air pollution, water pollution, pesticides, waste, aggregates, water use, natural resource use. Really, the idea of using taxes or economic instruments to regulate or achieve an environmental goal is becoming more common, and it is a much more efficient way to achieve these goals often. Why are they becoming more common? Why are they seen generally as the most effective tool by the economists? Well, the first reason is they work. And this is a slide, we're shifting from carbon to water. And this is a slide by McKinsey comparing the line in orange is the level of price or tax on water use in various countries around the world. And the gray bar you see behind it is the level of water consumption in those countries. And you see an almost direct inverse relationship. Those countries that put a higher price or fee on water use generally use the least water, with Ireland being the exception. I'm not sure why. Canada, of course, is at the bottom, the lowest price and the highest consumption. So they work. They're cost effective. Again, we saw the example of the carbon tax shift in European countries. One of the things to keep in mind is not only the overall effect on the economy, but what economic impact would have resulted if we'd used a different type of policy to achieve those GHG reductions, if we'd used a general regulation, for example. And there's a bunch of research suggesting that economic instruments, compared to a traditional command and control regulation, will often achieve greater cost efficiencies in the range of 30, 40, or 50%. Obviously, a lot depends on the particular instrument and the problem, but the point is you can achieve an environmental goal at a much, much lower cost using a tax or other type of economic instrument in most cases. Third is they can drive innovation. And this is a publication just put out by the OECD looking at various examples about how different environmental taxes have boosted innovation. And the logic behind it is pretty simple. If you think of a traditional pollution regulation that says everyone must get down to a particular level, it's sort of a speed limit approach. Your incentive is just to get to that level of pollution, but not to go beyond it. There's no incentive to go beyond it. An environmental tax, on the other hand, every unit of pollution you reduce, you make more money. So there's an incentive for companies and individuals to lower their pollution levels as far as they can and to find innovative ways of doing it. Now, obviously, the level of the price will affect how much innovation it induces, but as an instrument, it has a more innovation-inducing effect normally than a straight regulation. And again, this OECD report compares situations where there have been traditional regulations compared to taxes, and find taxes are almost always better at inducing innovation. I don't know if there's any fiscal wonks in the room, but in case you are, this is the last one. This is kind of interesting for someone who's here from a finance department who may not actually care that much about greenhouse gases. But at least in Western countries, most of us are facing what Canada's facing, which is called the fiscal squeeze. As our population ages, the main thing we tax is income. And as people move out of the workforce, their labor income goes down, and so government's tax bases go down too. And they go down at a time when spending is rising, particularly on healthcare. So you see this rising wedge, this rising deficit called the fiscal squeeze. What's interesting is shifting from income taxes to environmental taxes can lessen that fiscal squeeze. And it does so because as we age, our polluting and consuming behavior doesn't go down as much as our labor income goes down. And so there's less of a reduction in revenue as you shift towards green taxes or any types of consumption taxes, really. It's just a variation on consumption tax shifting. Anyway, this is kind of policy wonkish for fiscal experts, but it's really interesting if you're interested in that kind of stuff. So coming back, bottom line message, British Columbia brought in a carbon tax shift in 2008, way out ahead of the rest of North America in doing it. BC now has the lowest fuel use in Canada, the lowest income tax rates in Canada, and a healthy economy with a fast-growing clean technology sector. The Economist did a feature story on the carbon tax shift a little over a year ago and found it's a very effective policy and held it up as an example for the rest of the world of a model climate policy. So with that sort of introduction, why don't we open it up and move on to questions? So the format here, as I understand it, is you guys can feed in questions, and please do. But to start out with, we've got some initial questions that have been set up while you get your brains in gear. And my cell phone rings here, so I'll just shut it off. So first question, what are the main advantages of a carbon tax approach? Why should we consider using it instead of other instruments? And there's a range of options there. I'll just let you guys plug in some of your initial answers. Give you a second to do that. But I guess we don't want dead air, as they call it, right? So I'll talk as you guys do this, and we can all watch the little bars go. So obviously, because it's more popular, not surprisingly, so far 0%. And yeah, taxes are not known for their popularity. It'd be interesting to see if there's examples out there of places where people have seen it as popular, because BC, it's not unpopular. More cost-effective, for sure. This is probably the #1 reason to use a tax or economic instrument, is that you can just get to a goal in a lower cost way. To me, this idea of inducing innovation is one that's not understood very well, but it's really powerful. If we assume that innovation is going to be vital to solving not just climate change, but a lot of other key environmental threats, water scarcity, pollution, pesticide use, and others, the idea of using instruments that create an internal incentive for industries to innovate, rather than just to do the minimum, but to go further and actually put their creative innovation hat on, to me is really important. It changes the whole psychology of environmental regulation. Instead of being seen as sort of a necessary evil where we do the minimum, it actually shifts to a land of economic opportunity. Comprehensive coverage, well again, compared to cap and trade systems, which generally work best on major industries, taxes can apply across a whole economy, so it is actually an advantage. Simple to design? Yeah, in British Columbia. In Canada, for example, we've been looking at designing at the federal level a cap and trade system for almost a decade now. And you get bogged down in negotiations with each industry sector, what their baseline level is, and it's pretty complex. Those in the US will be familiar with this complexity, or Europe. Carbon tax is pretty simple, frankly. British Columbia's went from announcement to implementation in a few months, just built on the existing tax system. Last one, easier to revise over time than others? I don't think so. I think it's just as easy to revise a pollution standard as it is to revise a tax. So I guess I'm more or less in agreement with the group here, although I would place a higher value on the innovation. Okay, next question. Let's see, do I control that? The gurus in Washington do. Okay, so what are the keys to an effective carbon tax policy? You see various options here. Again, I'll give you guys a second to look at it. Okay, here's a few answers coming in, but let's talk about it. Setting the price high enough to have a big impact. Actually, yeah, I'm glad to see some people answering that one. In the end of the day, that's pretty important, right? If your goal is to actually achieve a particular greenhouse gas reduction, you've ultimately got to get that price at a high enough cost that it induces individuals and companies to reduce their behavior. And you see lots of studies out there, for example, about what level of carbon price is needed to induce carbon capture and sequestration. And you see estimates ranging from anywhere from $30 a ton to $80 or $90 a ton. But until you get to that cost, coal companies, it isn't going to be cost effective to shift to kind of clean coal or CCS technology. So setting the price is really important, but you don't have to start at that price. And I would agree with a lot of people who selected that second one. Politically, starting with a relatively low price and raising it really helps both politically, but plus it gives people time to adjust. If you just brought the price in right away, companies can't actually throw out all of their technology. Homeowners can't sell their car or change houses in the space of a year. It takes time. So a gradual ramp up is really good from a policy and political perspective. Comprehensive coverage, sure, that's important if you want to hit all sectors of the economy. Addressing competitive impacts. Yes, it's been interesting in BC because BC doesn't do that. At the moment, there is no adjustment for exposed sectors. And we haven't done deep economic analysis, but the kind of initial analysis been done shows that there isn't any evidence that there's been a significant impact on these sectors so far. Certainly the cement industry warns that there has been an impact, and they say it may get greater as the price rises. Agriculture talks about an impact, but again, our research finds it's been very small so far. But the big key is, what's the difference between your carbon price and those of your major competitors? And BC is actually out ahead of its competitors pretty much the whole price. There isn't a carbon price in most of North America. and BC is an export-import economy within North America. So the lesson I've heard talking to industry people is right now the level of BC's carbon tax isn't high enough to cause a major impact on competitiveness. It's just $30 a ton, which is about 7 cents per liter of gasoline. It's having some impact, but if it gets higher, as it gets higher and the gap between BC and others gets higher, there's going to have to be some sort of measures to address exposed sectors. The other thing I would say is if you're in a jurisdiction where coal is your major source of energy, then you may actually have to look at some kind of measures to address trade-exposed sectors. And there's lots of ways to do that. I won't get into real detail, but the one thing I'll say is this. In designing measures to buffer exposed industry sectors, what you don't want to do is exempt them from the tax, because then they have no incentive to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, to invest in clean technology, and you've created a chronic dependency at that point. You've basically set them up not to be competitive in an increasingly low-carbon marketplace. So what you can do is a bunch of things you can do. You can start them at a lower level and bring the level up more slowly for them. You can take some of the revenues and recycle it into support for investments in clean technology. You can help them offset the cost of investing in new technology to allow them to be effective in a low-carbon economy. So there's different ways to do it, but what you don't want to do is exempt them from the tax. And we've actually seen experiences of jurisdictions that have done this, and it hasn't worked very well. Last one, addressing impacts on vulnerable populations. Again, any type of environmental taxation or consumption tax is largely going to be regressive. It's going to have more effect on low-income people that spend a higher percentage of their income on fuel, for their homes particularly, but also for a vehicle. And so, yes, you should do something to address the particular impact on vulnerable populations. In BC, they gave additional tax cuts to low-income people. I can talk about how they did it later, but generally, at least for the first few years, this tax was neutral in terms of its impact on vulnerable populations. As the price rises, the research suggests that's changing, but at least started out without impacting vulnerable populations. But again, one thing to keep in mind is carbon taxes do particularly impact vulnerable populations, but so do other types of environmental policies. People tend not to think about the fact that a regulation, for example, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions would also raise the price of fuels, but what it wouldn't do is create this pool of revenue that a carbon tax does, which can be used to recycle and compensate affected populations. So again, keep in mind, compared to other types of policy instruments, carbon taxes are not worse in their impact on vulnerable populations. It's just more transparent, and it also gives you better revenue options for buffering that impact. Okay, move on to number 3. We'll do this one fairly quickly to get to open questions. How can governments generally use the revenues? How should governments use revenues generated by carbon taxes? As you guys answer, let me say these revenues can be pretty high. So in BC, carbon tax revenues are now over $1 billion. And again, this is for a relatively small economy with a population of less than 4 million people. If you were to have the same level of taxation across all of Canada, for example, you would be looking at revenues more in the range of probably $20 billion a year. That's pretty significant. For example, Canada's value-added tax, or GST, each 1% of GST, each 1 cent of GST generates somewhere in the revenue of $6 billion. So a carbon tax alone would bring in roughly half the revenue that Canada's value-added tax does, and even at the relatively low level we currently see in British Columbia. So it's a fairly significant revenue source. What can you do with that? Okay, lots of options. There's no one right answer here. A lot of this is about politics. This is really a question of how should governments spend our tax dollars, and there's different answers. But from an economic efficiency viewpoint, putting the revenue back into reducing other distortionary income taxes is generally seen as the most economically efficient outcome. It's the one that will have the least overall impact on the economy. But you often hear from industry that they would like a lot of the revenue recycled into supporting investment in clean technology as a way of helping industry make the transition, or homeowners having it support particularly home energy retrofits. We talked about mitigating impacts on vulnerable groups, investing in public sector infrastructure like transit or modernizing the electricity grid to support green energy. Again, a really important investment. And the last one, it's interesting, no one talked about general income. Maybe if we worded that as deficit reduction, we might have had a different answer. But the reality of it is, we're in an era when most governments face significant economic deficits. And they're probably going to have to raise taxes somewhere in order to do that. So what taxes do you want to raise? Do you want to raise taxes on income? Do you want to raise taxes on consumption? Do you want to cut retirees' pension plans? Or do you want to raise taxes on pollution? And compared to all of those, frankly, environmental taxes look not bad. So maybe let's shift it over and get general questions from you guys. So let's look at different questions. Start with a fairly simple one. This is from Tina Bursma, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. My apologies if I'm not. 5-year phase-in is a fairly swift window for investors, or I think she probably also means for companies to kind of shift their technology. How do you create longer-term predictability? That's a great question. When I talk with industry folks about this is really the main issue, is a lot of them are making investments in major technology that may be around 10, 20, 30 years. You think of a major coal power plant. And what they want to know is, what's the carbon price going to be over that period so I can look at the return on my investment? So creating a longer-term window of certainty really matters. BC's 5-year window is better than none, which is what we usually have. But an ideal policy would actually look at what the expected trajectory of that carbon price is over a 10 to 20-year period. Now, one thing I'd add is you're going to need an adjustment mechanism. Obviously, things change in the world, and you can't lock yourself in irrevocably. So any type of longer-term trajectory needs to have some kind of mechanism that will allow for adjustment, as we see around interest rates, for example. Right? We have long-term predictions, but periodic adjustment mechanisms. But if I were doing an ideal tax, I would have longer-term benchmarks for where it goes to fuel investment certainty. Simple one, Jose Echeverry. Is 100% of revenue returned to the citizens? Yes. In fact, over 100% is in British Columbia because the income tax cuts have exceeded the carbon taxes. It has been in the form of the big cuts are cuts to corporate income tax is the biggest, cut to personal income tax is the next biggest, and then particular cuts for vulnerable populations. There's also a specific tax cut for rural residents because they don't have as much access to public transit, for example. They tend to have fewer options. But yes, 100% of revenues, 100% revenue neutral. Just looking at different questions as they come in here. This is a really good question. So again, I'll probably get some of these names wrong. Sorry. German Gripovic asked the question, what do you think about carbon tax versus cap and trade? How long do you have? I'll try and sort of do some high level. So both of them put a price on carbon. And so in that way, both of them have the two main benefits. They're more cost effective than straight conventional command and control regulation. They allow companies to adjust their behavior in individuals based on the different prices they face. The second advantage is they induce innovation. They create an economic signal that induces you to go further than a straight carbon regulation would. You continue to make more money the more you reduce your emissions. And so they induce innovation. Those are the two biggies. So they're the same on that. But by other measures, a carbon tax is generally seen as a better instrument than cap and trade for a bunch of reasons. One is it's simpler and quicker to design. You don't have to come up with regulatory baselines for every industry and company in your country. And particularly for a developing country that may not yet have a sophisticated, comprehensive industrial emissions regulation system, creating that's going to take a while. Whereas most of you have a tax system and probably have some kind of system around fuel taxation, and you just build on that. British Columbia showed how simple it is. Also, much easier to make it comprehensive. Applying a fuel tax or carbon tax across the whole economy is relatively easy. Cap and trade systems have a lot of transaction costs. You have to get into the buying and selling of carbon credits requires a certain level of wealth and sophistication. And so major industries usually are the ones subject to a cap and trade system. Again, so carbon tax probably better, but frankly, either of them is better than a conventional regulatory approach. Putting a price on carbons is a better system. What about carbon leakage? That's a good question. In other words, in British Columbia or other places, have we seen, as a carbon price goes up, carbon-intensive industries picking up and moving elsewhere? Well, we haven't really seen that yet in BC, but I'll say there hasn't been a significant rigorous economic study of that. And the main one that talks about that as a risk is the cement industry, which says they're starting to see increased imports of cement from northern Washington state, which is close enough that transport costs are not that high, that the difference in carbon taxes in Canada may be starting to cause a little bit of increased imports of fuel from Washington state, which doesn't have the same type of carbon reduction policy. So as a carbon tax gets high enough, as the difference between you and your competitors gets high enough, you will see some kind of leakage. And particularly where you'll see it is industries that have two factors. One's where energy or fuel use is a very big part of their cost base. So cement is an example. Any type of mineral refining, nickel smelting, metal, pulp and paper mills, which are very energy intensive, you can often see that. But also ones that are trade exposed, ones where a lot of their product goes to export markets that may not have a similar price. So energy intensive, trade exposed industries are where you're going to see it. Interestingly, at the price level we're seeing in BC, $30 a ton and less, you're not seeing that much leakage. But one could predict as the cost gets higher, you will start to see it. And again, I talked about earlier, you probably do need some kind of an adjustment mechanism so that you're not actually beginning to see the loss of some of those industry sectors. But you want to make sure they do face some kind of a price so that they're investing in low carbon clean technology and not just locking in inefficient practices that are ultimately going to hurt them in the marketplace. Let's see, I'm just looking at some of these other questions as they come across. What price would be necessary to achieve Copenhagen commitments? Well, again, that depends on the jurisdiction. And for Canada, part of it depends on how quickly you start, too. The earlier you start, the lower the cost is, because you get going on this. But generally, you see cost estimates for Canada, for example, in the range of between $100 and $200 per ton, ultimately, to get to our Copenhagen commitments. That's a pretty high carbon price. And certainly in the current economic and political reality, it may be a little difficult to envision that. By the way, sorry, this question is from Andrew Ferguson. But one thing to keep in mind is ultimately this policy or any climate policy is going to be most effective if it's brought in by large numbers of countries. Climate change is a global problem, and we're not going to solve it by one country going alone. Obviously, major emitters like the US and China can have a significant impact. A country like Canada, that's about 2% of the world's fossil GHG emissions, is important, but us going alone isn't going to solve it. So we're going to need to see countries moving together in some sort of carbon pricing policy. They don't have to all be the same policy, but they should be moving in a coordinated way. And this lessens some of those competitiveness impacts. In fact, if countries did this in a coordinated way, even, for example, if North America did it in a coordinated way, since a lot of trading happens within the North American region or the European region, the same thing, you're actually not going to see significant economic effects because you're simply shifting taxes and shifting costs from some investments to others. Yes, people are going to be investing less in high-polluting, energy-intensive sectors, but they're going to be investing more in more fuel-efficient, energy-efficient sectors and technologies. So those type of higher prices are possible, but they're possible if countries do it in conjunction with their major trading partners. What British Columbia has done is shown that you can actually get out ahead and get started. You don't have to wait for everyone to move in lockstep before you get going. And this is a really powerful example that we don't have to wait for everyone to move at once to get started. Just sort of seeing some other questions that come in here. How do we ensure, again, this is one from Jose Echeverry, who seems to be a profound source of questions. Good ones, too. How do we ensure politicians embrace and implement carbon taxes? To me, this is the hardest question of all. We've got an issue where there's general agreement among economists that this is the right policy, but it's generally seen as difficult politics by politicians. Part of it is to tell the story of British Columbia and other places where this has been done, and it's been politically either neutral or slightly successful. In other words, you can do this without it having a political cost, and BC is an example. So some of the lessons I talked about don't make it a major election issue, design the carbon tax shift in a clean way so that it's simple and not complex, um, begin low and ramp it up, but also talk to people about this in the context of shifting to a low carbon economy. One of the best examples I ever got was from a public communications advisor who said to us, if you're in the travel industry and you're talking about tourism, you're trying to sell tropical vacations, you talk about the beach, not the flight to get there. In other words, you talk about why it's important to shift to a low carbon economy, both the environmental benefits, the economic benefits, and why we'll all be better off as a society if we do that. Then you talk about how you get there. You don't necessarily focus on a complex policy instrument like this one because, frankly, most of us aren't policy wonks and spend our time sitting around how to revise the tax system. Some of us do, but sadly the rest of the world doesn't share that preoccupation. So start by talking about how we need to change our behavior, change the nature of our economy to achieve a low-polluting, low-carbon economy, and then talk about carbon taxation in the context of how you get there. It's not an end, it's a means. And we've got to talk about the end before the means becomes interesting to people. I guess that would be my major advice. The other one, though, is I don't think this should be a left-right political wedge issue. To me, if you're a conservative voter or a liberal, socially minded voter, you still depend on the atmosphere. You still depend on pollution affects you. So there's an impact that cuts across the political spectrum. And I think it's really important not to let these type of policies get caught in left-right politics. To me, that's why it's really interesting in Canada. This was brought in by a right-of-center government, and there's two other places in Canada that have type of carbon price, either a low carbon tax or cap and trade, Alberta and Quebec. Both of them were also brought in by parties on the right end of their political spectrum. So to me, I like seeing that this isn't just seen as a policy of socialist or left-wing governments. It's also a policy being advanced and embraced by right-of-center parties. Trying to see if we have time for one more question. They haven't cut me off yet, so I'm going to assume they will. Here's a question from Danielle Marks. So this is about Alberta and their oil sands. Probably most people in the world have heard about Alberta's oil sands, the second largest known deposit of oil and gas or oil reserves in the world, but also ones that are difficult and energy intensive to extract because they're embedded in different types of sand or tar, as some people call it. So it's become a pretty high profile issue. So would a carbon tax be effective in Alberta applied to the tar sand industry? And I can tell you, yes, by far. It would be the most effective way to create an incentive for Alberta's oil sands to move to cleaner, low-carbon technology, but also to develop the resource in a more responsible way. Now, the price we see so far, $30 a ton, would get started. It would achieve some initial investments. You're going to need to see that price get higher before you start to see some of the more expensive technologies start to get cost effective. So in particular, Alberta uses coal as its major energy source. And you want to create an incentive either to shift to green power or to use clean coal or carbon capture and sequestration. And again, you see various estimates, but in the range of $30, $50, $60, $70 a ton before those start to get cost effective. What's interesting too, though, and again, I think it's important to say this, a lot of the major oil companies operating in the oil sands understand this. And a number of them are actually pushing the government to bring in a carbon tax. I'm not going to say it publicly because they don't like to get politically controversial, but I can tell you that several of Canada's major oil and gas companies are actually advocating quietly to government that they bring in a carbon tax as a way of inducing this type of carbon efficiency in Alberta and elsewhere. They would like to see a lot of the revenues used to fund investments in clean technology to help accelerate the transition to these types of cleaner technologies. And I don't want to sound Pollyanna. It's not going to be easy to make Alberta's oil sands industry environmentally responsible. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of investment and a lot of innovation. And certainly from my understanding, we're not sure we can get there yet, but we don't know until we try. And the best way to try is to create the right economic incentives that will induce this type of behavior, and the same for their water use. I think I hear myself being called.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Stuart, for this great presentation, and thank you to all the participants for posing such great and engaging questions and also challenging our speaker a little bit. I think this webinar shows that a carbon tax is definitely a very relevant topic, and we've discussed both the challenges, but also the very many opportunities that a carbon tax can pose, and how also it gives the perspective to bring together the fiscal and climate policy community closer together.
Yeah, and let me thank all of you. That's great to have. Sorry about that. I just wanted to say before I get cut off, thank you to all of you. Many of you doing this at odd hours. Great questions, and feel free to follow up with me by email if you have further questions. I'm easy to find. Just Google me at University of Ottawa. Thanks.
And if you, all participants, want to go back to the webinar, I'll let you know that the recordings of this webinar will be available within the next 24 hours on the following link that you can see on the screen, and also the presentation from Stuart will be available there. So I suggest you all go and look there if you wish to go back. So thank you very much for your participation.